Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that followed old sins and unspoken truths. It sat between dry hills and broken fence lines, a town built on dust, cattle money, and memories people preferred to forget. Wind creaked through loose boards and rattled signs that had not been repainted in years. Men here spoke softly and watched carefully. Women carried strength behind tired eyes. And everyone understood that nothing truly stayed buried in Red Hollow, no matter how deep it was pushed into the dirt. On a pale morning when the sun rose like a warning instead of a promise, a lone rider appeared on the eastern road. His horse moved slow and steady, hooves pressing into the earth as if they remembered this land better than the man riding it. He wore no badge, no flashy coat, nothing that marked him as trouble. Yet when the townsfolk noticed him, conversations thinned and doors closed halfway. Some recognized the way he sat his saddle. Others remembered the shape of his shoulders. And a few, the ones who mattered most, felt their stomachs tighten with a fear they had hoped never to feel again. The rancher had returned. His name had not been spoken aloud in months, but it had never left the town. He once owned the largest stretch of grazing land near Red Hollow, land that fed families and kept the town alive during harsh winters. He was known as a fair man, slow to anger and strict with his word. When disputes arose, he settled them with work instead of fists and reason instead of bullets. That reputation was why his disappearance years ago unsettled the town so deeply. Men like him did not leave without a reason, and when they did, it was rarely without consequences. As he rode closer, a woman stepped out from beside the general store. Her dress was plain, her hair pulled tight, but fear sharpened her movements. She had been waiting since before sunrise, standing in the cold with hands clenched as if holding herself together. When she saw him clearly, her breath caught and her resolve nearly broke. Yet she walked forward anyway, crossing the road with hurried steps, her boots scraping against the dirt like they were counting down to something inevitable. She reached him before anyone else dared approach. She spoke his name quietly, not as a greeting but as a warning. Her voice shook as she begged him to turn back, to leave things as they were, to not do what he had come to do. She told him the town had changed, that people had moved on, that reopening old wounds would destroy what little peace remained. Her words spilled out in a rush, shaped by fear and regret and a knowledge she could not fully explain in front of so many watching eyes. The rancher listened without interrupting. He looked down at her, his expression carved from patience and something far heavier. There was no anger in his eyes, no hesitation either. Only resolve, steady and immovable as the land itself. When she reached for his sleeve, he gently pulled away. That single motion spoke louder than any argument. Whatever decision he had made, it had been settled long before his horse touched the edge of Red Hollow. People gathered slowly, pretending to mind their own business while watching everything. The sheriff stood near the saloon, one hand resting too close to his belt. The men who owned the bank and the largest freight contracts exchanged nervous glances. They had built their fortunes during the rancher's absence, quietly and efficiently, making sure no one asked how. They knew exactly why he was back, even if no one else dared say it. The rancher dismounted near the center of town and tied his horse to a post worn smooth by years of use. He did not look at the sheriff or the businessmen. Instead, he studied the buildings, the fences, the land itself. It was as if he were measuring what had changed and what had not. He walked with the weight of memory in every step, each one echoing against the wooden boardwalks like a slow drumbeat calling the past forward. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and tension. The rancher ordered nothing stronger than water, a choice that unsettled those watching him more than whiskey ever could. He spoke briefly with the barkeep, asking questions that seemed harmless on the surface. Who owned what land now? Which families had stayed? Which names had vanished? Every answer tightened the invisible noose hanging over the room. Outside, the woman waited, pacing back and forth as if motion alone could change fate. She had known this day would come. Years earlier, she had chosen silence over truth, safety over justice. She told herself she had done it to protect the town, to protect herself. Now she understood that what she had really protected was a lie. And lies, like bad soil, poisoned everything they touched. By afternoon, word had spread beyond Red Hollow. Riders arrived from nearby settlements, drawn by rumor and curiosity. Something was happening, something important enough to pull people from their work and bring them riding hard under the open sky. The rancher had not announced anything, yet the tension grew heavier with every passing hour. It pressed down on the town until even breathing felt deliberate. When the rancher finally stepped out into the open again, the woman rushed toward him one last time. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, reminding him of old friendships, of shared losses, of nights when the town had leaned on him for guidance. She told him that what he was about to do would not just hurt the guilty, but everyone. Children would suffer. Homes would fall apart. Red Hollow might not survive another reckoning. He met her eyes then, truly met them, and for a moment the hardness softened. He told her quietly that some towns were built on truth and others on fear, and that Red Hollow had chosen wrong a long time ago. He said he had lived with the weight of that choice every day since he left. And he said that, no matter what followed, it was time the land remembered who it truly belonged to. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street as people gathered in uneasy silence. The rancher stepped forward and began the process that would unravel everything the town believed about itself. Papers were brought out. Names were spoken. Witnesses stepped from the crowd, some trembling, others defiant. With each revelation, the town shifted, as if the ground itself were rejecting the lies layered upon it. Faces went pale, voices rose. The sheriff hesitated, torn between duty and fear. The men who had once controlled everything realized too late that power built on stolen ground could not stand forever. And in the middle of it all stood the rancher, calm and unyielding, the eye of a storm he had come home to unleash. As night fell, lanterns were lit, their glow flickering across faces changed by truth. The woman stood apart now, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. She understood that her plea had failed, but she also understood something deeper. The town had needed this moment, even if it destroyed them, even if it burned everything down to bare earth. The rancher looked toward the dark horizon beyond Red Hollow, knowing this was only the beginning. What he had set in motion could not be undone. Justice would demand payment. Blood might follow. But the lie was broken, and the land was finally speaking again. The wind carried his name through the empty spaces between. Buildings as Red Hollow prepared to face the dawn forever changed. Night settled over Red Hollow like a heavy blanket pulled too tight. Lantern lights spilled across the dirt streets, throwing long, uneven shadows that twisted against the walls of buildings that had witnessed too much. The truth spoken earlier still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. People did not return to their homes right away. They lingered in groups, whispering, arguing, watching one another as if the town itself had become unfamiliar ground beneath their boots. The rancher remained near the center of it all, seated on a worn bench outside the courthouse that had not seen real justice in years. He said little now because the time for words had passed. His presence alone was enough to keep the tension alive. Men who once walked with confidence avoided his gaze. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of anger and awe. No one could deny that the land had shifted beneath them, even if they did not yet understand how far the tremor would spread. The sheriff paced nearby, removing his hat and putting it back on again as if hoping the gesture might settle his thoughts. He had known parts of the truth enough to haunt his sleep, but never enough to act. Now the truth stood exposed under lantern light, demanding choices that could no longer be delayed. His badge felt heavier than it ever had, and for the first time in years, he wondered whether he had earned the right to wear it. From the edge of town came the sound of hooves. Riders approached without hurry, their silhouettes cutting through the darkness like questions without answers. These were men tied to the land in ways deeper than paperwork. Some had lost grazing rights years earlier without explanation. Others had been forced to sell at unfair prices when times grew hard. They had come because something had awakened, something they felt in their bones before they ever heard the rumors. The woman watched them arrive, standing apart beneath the awning of the general store. Her heart pounded with every new face that entered the circle of lantern light. She had begged the rancher to stop because she knew what came next when buried truths were dragged into the open. Violence often followed honesty in places like Red Hollow. Yet she could not bring herself to regret his return entirely. Somewhere beneath her fear lived a quiet hope that the town might finally be freed from the weight it carried. A man stepped forward from the group of new arrivals, older than most, his back bent from years of work and disappointment. He spoke the rancher's name aloud for the first time that night, his voice steady but thick with emotion. He told the crowd how his family had lost their land, how contracts had been altered and signatures forged while he was away fighting for a country that forgot him the moment he returned. Murmurs spread as others recognized his story in their own lives. The rancher listened, nodding once, his eyes never leaving the speaker. When the man finished, the rancher stood and addressed the gathered crowd. He spoke plainly, without flourish, explaining that what had been done to one had been done to many. He said the land records would be challenged, the sales examined, and the truth forced into the open no matter how painful the process became. His voice carried authority not because it was loud, but because it carried conviction. That was when the first threat came, spoken not in anger but in calculation. One of the town's wealthiest men stepped forward, his fine coat marking him as someone who had benefited greatly from the rancher's absence. He warned that stirring this kind of trouble would bring bloodshed, that outside interests would not allow Red Hollow to unravel quietly. He spoke of hired guns, of legal maneuvers, of consequences that would reach far beyond the town limits. The rancher met the threat without flinching. He replied that consequences had already arrived, and that fear had ruled Red Hollow long enough. His words landed hard, stripping the warning of its power. For the first time, the wealthy man hesitated, realizing that intimidation no longer held the weight it once did. As the night deepened, lines were drawn without a single bullet fired. Families stood with those they trusted. Old friendships fractured under the strain of exposed lies. The woman moved among them quietly, offering water, calming voices, doing what she could to prevent the tension from boiling over. Every step she took felt like a small act of atonement, though she knew no amount of kindness could erase the years she had chosen silence. Near midnight, the rancher announced his intention to stay. He would not ride out under cover of darkness. He would not retreat to safety. He would face whatever came next alongside the people who had been wronged. That declaration changed everything. Red Hollow was no longer a place waiting for trouble to pass through. It had become the center of something larger, something that could reshape lives for generations. Sleep came fitfully to the town that night. Some lay awake clutching rifles, others staring at ceilings cracked by age and worry. The woman sat by her window until dawn, watching the rancher's horse tied patiently in the street, its presence a reminder that there was no turning back. She wondered whether she would have the courage to speak fully when the time came, to admit her role in the lie that had protected the guilty and punished the innocent. Morning broke harsh and bright, offering no comfort. Dust rose quickly as people gathered again, drawn by instinct and unfinished business. The rancher stood before the courthouse with documents spread across a table, the physical weight of truth made visible. Names were read aloud. Transactions questioned. Witnesses stepped forward, some reluctantly, others with relief written plainly across their faces. Resistance came swiftly. A group of men attempted to seize the documents, hoping to destroy what they represented. They were stopped, not by violence, but by the people themselves. Farmers, ranch hands, widows, and laborers formed a wall of bodies between the truth and those who feared it. The sheriff finally acted, stepping into his role with a resolve that surprised even him, ordering the men to stand down and reminding them that the law still existed, even if it had been ignored. The moment marked a turning point. The town saw that the rancher was not alone, and neither were they. Courage proved contagious, spreading from one person to the next until fear no longer held absolute control. The woman felt tears rise as she watched neighbors defend one another, realizing that the future might hold something other than regret. By late afternoon, messengers were sent to neighboring counties. Legal proceedings were set in motion. The process would be long and costly, but it had begun. The rancher knew the road ahead would not be easy. Enemies would gather. Pressure would mount. But the foundation had been laid, and it rested on truth rather than silence. As the sun dipped toward the horizon once more, Red Hollow stood changed yet again, not healed, not peaceful, but awake. The rancher looked across the town, seeing not just buildings and land, but people standing at the edge of transformation. The woman approached him quietly, her voice steady for the first time in years. She told him she was ready to tell everything she knew, no matter the cost. He nodded, accepting her words without judgment. knowing that redemption often began with a single honest step. Above them, the sky burned with the colors of endings and beginnings, and Red Hollow prepared to face whatever the next day demanded without hiding from the truth ever again. The morning after Truth began to walk openly through Red Hollow did not arrive gently. It came sharp and unforgiving, carried on a wind that cut through coats and resolve alike. The town awoke knowing something irreversible had begun, and every sound seemed louder for it. Doors opened slower. Boots hit the dirt with caution. Even the animals sensed the shift, horses restless in their ties, cattle lowing uneasily beyond the fences. The rancher stood early, already awake long before the sun cleared the hills. He washed at the pump behind the courthouse, the cold water grounding him in the present. For years he had carried this moment inside him, imagining how it might unfold. Now that it was here, it felt heavier than he had expected, not because of fear, but because of the lives bound to what he had set in motion. The woman joined him quietly, wrapped in a shawl against the chill. She had not slept at all. Her eyes were red, but there was a steadiness in her posture that had not been there before. She told him she would speak that day, not in whispers or half-truths, but fully and openly. She said the town deserved to hear it all, and so did he. The rancher thanked her with a nod, understanding the courage such a choice required in a place that punished honesty. By mid-morning, Red Hollow gathered again, drawn by equal parts fear and curiosity. This time the crowd was larger, bolstered by riders from nearby ranches and settlements. Some came to support the rancher, others came to protect their interests. The space between them felt charged, like a dry field waiting for a spark. The sheriff positioned himself near the steps of the courthouse, flanked by two deputies whose loyalty was no longer in doubt. His face was set hard, lines deepened by a night of decision. When he called the gathering to order, his voice carried farther than it ever had before. Authority, once reclaimed, had a way of amplifying itself. The woman stepped forward first. A hush fell over the crowd as she stood alone before them, small against the weight of expectation yet unbowed. She began to speak, her voice trembling at first, then growing stronger as the truth took shape. She told them about the night the original agreement was altered, about the men who pressured her, about the threats made behind closed doors. She spoke of documents hidden, signatures forged, and promises broken in the name of profit. Faces shifted as recognition spread. Some turned away in shame. Others clenched their fists in denial. The men she named did not interrupt her, though their eyes burned with quiet fury. They knew the damage was done. The lie had lived because it was protected by silence, and silence had just been shattered. When she finished, the rancher stepped beside her. He did not need to add much. The truth now stood on its own legs. He spoke of the families driven out, of land seized under false pretenses, of a town that had slowly traded its soul for comfort. He reminded them that Red Hollow had once been built on fairness, on shared hardship and mutual respect. What it had become was the result of choices made again and again to look away. The reaction was immediate and divided. Shouts erupted from both sides. Accusations flew like sparks. The sheriff raised his voice, demanding order, but the tension had reached a breaking point. That was when a gunshot cracked through the air, fired not at a person but into the ground, a warning meant to freeze the moment. Every head turned toward the man holding the smoking pistol. He was younger than most expected, a hired hand who had risen quickly under the protection of one of the powerful landowners. His message was clear. This was not going to end quietly. The rancher did not reach for his own weapon. He stepped forward instead, placing himself between the shooter and the crowd. His calm was unsettling, a reminder that courage often looked like stillness in the face of chaos. He told the young man to lower the gun, not as an order, but as a statement of fact. After a long moment, the pistol was lowered, though the threat remained. The sheriff moved decisively then, disarming the man and placing him under arrest. It was a small act, but it carried enormous weight. For the first time, the law was being applied where it had long been bent. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people realized what they were witnessing. That afternoon, sides were chosen openly. Some families packed their belongings, preparing to leave rather than face the consequences of exposure. Others pledged their support to the rancher, offering labor, protection, and testimony. Red Hollow had become a town at war with itself, not over land alone, but over identity. The rancher spent the rest of the day meeting with those willing to stand beside him. Plans were made to secure records, protect witnesses, and prepare for retaliation. He knew the men who had benefited most would not surrender easily. They had money, influence, and friends beyond the county lines. What they lacked was legitimacy, and that absence gnawed at them. As evening approached, the woman returned to her home, standing alone in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. Memories crowded the space, some tender, others painful. She understood now that her fear had not spared her from suffering, it had only delayed it. Speaking the truth had not erased her guilt, but it had given her something she had not felt in years, a sense of alignment with herself. Night fell again over Red Hollow, heavier than before. This time there was movement in the darkness beyond the town. Riders passed along the ridges, watching, waiting. Word had spread faster than expected, and forces were gathering that cared little for justice and everything for control. The rancher stood watch near the edge of town, rifle slung across his back, eyes scanning the horizon. He knew what was coming. The next test would not be fought with words or documents. It would be measured in resolve and sacrifice. Still, he felt no regret. Whatever happened next, the lie was finished, and Red Hollow would never again pretend it was something it was not. As the moon climbed high and the wind whispered through the grass, the town held its breath, balanced between destruction and rebirth, waiting for the moment when the choices made would finally demand their price. The riders on the ridges did not move through the night without purpose. They watched Red Hollow the way wolves watched a wounded elk, patient and calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. Torches flickered on distant hillsides, then vanished, signaling messages meant only for those who understood them. By dawn, the town would no longer be dealing with words and accusations. What came next would be decided by force, courage, and who was willing to stand their ground. The rancher felt it long before anyone else said it aloud. He had lived enough years on open land to recognize the shape of danger. He ordered extra watches before midnight, placing trusted men at every road and low pass leading into town. Rifles were cleaned quietly, ammunition counted twice. No one spoke of fear, but it lived in the way hands tightened around coffee cups and eyes lingered too long on the darkness. The woman did not sleep. She sat by her table with a lamp burning low, writing down everything she remembered, every name, every meeting, every lie she had helped keep alive. Each word felt like a weight lifted from her chest and added to the paper instead. She knew these pages might become her shield or her sentence, but she wrote anyway. Truth, once chosen, demanded completion. Just before first light, the sound of hooves reached the outskirts of Red Hollow. Not the cautious approach of travelers, but the deliberate rhythm of men riding together. The town guards raised the alarm, bells ringing out across the still air. Doors slammed, women gathered children, men rushed to their posts. The sheriff took position near the courthouse steps, shotgun in hand, his jaw set with grim resolve. The riders emerged from the dust as the sun crested the hills, their numbers larger than anyone had hoped. They wore no single uniform, but their allegiance was clear in the way they moved together. At their center rode two of the most powerful men in the county, faces hard and confident, certain that force would succeed where intimidation had failed. They stopped just short of the town boundary, creating a tense line where law ended and threat began. One of the men called out, his voice smooth and practiced. He demanded the return of documents, the silencing of witnesses, and the immediate departure of the rancher. He promised that if these conditions were met, Red Hollow would be spared further trouble. The rancher stepped forward alone to meet the demand. He did not raise his weapon or his voice. He told them that Red Hollow would no longer bend to men who stole land and hid behind hired guns. He said the documents were already on their way to higher authorities and that the truth could not be outridden. His words carried across the open space like a challenge carved in stone. The answer came swiftly. A shot rang out, striking a wooden post near the rancher and splintering it apart. Chaos threatened to erupt, but discipline held. The rancher did not move. Neither did the sheriff. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire, broken only by the wind rolling dust between two sides that had chosen their fate. Negotiation ended there. The first charge came from the riders, a sudden rush meant to overwhelm before defenses could settle. Red Hollow responded with equal force. Rifles cracked, horses screamed. The dust and smoke blurred the line between friend and foe. The battle spilled across the outskirts of town, raw and unglamorous, fought by people who understood that survival depended on holding ground inch by inch. The woman sheltered children in the cellar of the general store, her hands steady even as shots echoed above. Fear still lived in her chest, but it no longer ruled her actions. She had spent too many years letting fear decide for her. Now she chose responsibility instead. The sheriff fought like a man reclaiming his name. He directed defenses, rallied men who wavered, and stood his ground when bullets tore into the dirt at his feet. Each order he gave carried the weight of a law finally enforced. For the first time, Red Hollow fought not as individuals, but as a town united by shared truth. The rancher moved through the fight with calm precision, protecting positions, pulling wounded to safety, and never wasting emotion. This was not vengeance for him. It was guardianship. He fought because the land and the people tied to it deserved a future free from fear disguised as authority. As the sun climbed higher, the attackers realized Red Hollow would not fold. They had expected panic and disarray. Instead, they faced resistance born of resolve. One by one, their momentum faltered. Some retreated under fire. Others were disarmed and captured. The leaders saw the tide turning and made the decision to withdraw, signaling their men to fall back. The retreat was messy and bitter, marked by curses and promises of return, but it was a retreat nonetheless. Red Hollow held when the dust settled. The town stood scarred but standing. Several buildings bore bullet marks. A few men lay wounded, tended quickly by neighbors who moments earlier had barely trusted one another. Loss had come, but it had not broken them. The rancher surveyed the damage quietly, his expression unreadable. Victory brought no satisfaction, only confirmation that the path ahead would remain difficult. He knew the men who fled would not abandon their ambitions entirely. But they had been forced into the open, stripped of the illusion that fear alone could control a town awake to its own worth. As evening approached, the woman emerged from the cellar, guiding the children into the fading light. She looked at Red Hollow with new eyes, seeing not just a place of past mistakes, but a community capable of change. When she found the rancher, she handed him the pages she had written. He accepted them with care, understanding their importance far beyond ink and paper. That night, Red Hollow gathered again, not in fear this time, but in reflection. Stories were shared. Wounds were bound. Quiet laughter even found space among the exhaustion. The town had faced its reckoning and survived the first wave. Above them, the stars burned clear and sharp, indifferent to human struggle, yet witnessing it all the same. Red Hollow was no longer silent. It had spoken, fought, and chosen its future with open eyes and steady hands. Morning rose over Red Hollow like a cautious promise. The sun climbed slowly, illuminating scars left behind by the night before. Bullet marks marred walls that had once seemed untouchable. Wagon tracks cut deep lines through the dirt streets. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys where people brewed coffee with hands that still trembled from memory rather than cold. Yet beneath the damage lived something unfamiliar to the town, a sense of standing upright after years of carrying weight bent across its back. The rancher walked the streets at first light, checking on the wounded and speaking quietly with families who had stood their ground. He offered no speeches and accepted no praise. What mattered to him was not how the town saw him, but how the town now saw itself. He could feel the change in the way people met his eyes, no longer pleading for guidance, but sharing responsibility. The woman joined him near the courthouse, her posture different than it had been before. There was still sorrow in her face, still regret, but it no longer owned her. She had chosen truth and survived it. Together they watched the sheriff organize patrols and assign men to escort the documents beyond Red Hollow's borders. Riders prepared to carry the truth farther than threats could reach. By midday, wagons arrived bearing officials from neighboring counties. Drawn by reports of violence and legal challenge, these men carried badges polished by distance from the dust and blood of frontier life. They expected chaos. Instead, they found order forged through hardship. Witnesses stepped forward freely. Evidence was presented clearly. The town spoke not in fragments, but with one voice shaped by shared resolve. The powerful men who had once ruled Red Hollow were summoned and confronted. Stripped of intimidation and secrecy, they looked smaller beneath open scrutiny. Their wealth could not silence a town no longer willing to look away. Deals were exposed, holdings were frozen. Arrests followed not with celebration but with quiet understanding that justice was rarely loud when it finally arrived. The rancher stood apart during these proceedings, his role nearly finished. He had come to awaken the truth, not to rule what followed. When asked what he wanted in return, he answered simply that the land be restored to those it had been taken from and that Red Hollow be allowed to choose its own future without fear. The days that followed were filled with work. Fences were rebuilt, homes repaired, fields prepared for planting once more. The town moved with purpose, bound together not by comfort but by earned trust. Children laughed openly again, their voices carrying across streets that no longer felt haunted by unspoken wrongs. The woman took on a new role among them, helping organize records and aid families returning to land long denied them. Some looked at her with lingering hurt, but more saw the courage it had taken to stand against the past she once protected. Redemption did not erase memory, but it reshaped it into something useful. One evening, as the sky burned gold and red above the hills, the rancher prepared to leave. His horse stood ready, saddle worn smooth by years of travel. The town gathered quietly, no speeches given, no banners raised. Gratitude lived in small gestures, a clasped hand, a nod of respect, a shared silence that said more than words could. The woman approached him then, asking where he would go. He answered honestly that he did not know. The land stretched wide beyond Red Hollow, and there were other places where truth waited to be spoken. She thanked him not for saving the town, but for trusting it to save itself. As he rode out, the town did not feel abandoned. It felt entrusted. The sheriff watched until the rider disappeared into the distance, then turned back toward his people, knowing leadership was no longer about authority, but accountability. Seasons passed, and Red Hollow endured. Land changed hands lawfully. New families arrived. Old ones returned. The town carried its history openly, scars and all, understanding that what had nearly destroyed it had also given it strength. Years later, stories would be told of the rancher who returned when silence ruled and left when truth took root. Some would exaggerate, others would forget details. But the heart of the tale remained unchanged. One man refused to stop when begged, not out of cruelty, but because stopping would have meant surrendering the future to fear. Red Hollow stood as proof that towns, like people, could choose who they became when